something that we could come off the dome with and really step back and say, where did conservatives or Republicans, where did they fail Christians? Now, I believe the question was inserted in because during Trump's, time as president, Republicans that supported him, conservatives that supported him, I feel they failed the Christians in not being completely transparent with the whole truth. What I mean by that is there were some politicians out there that were like, yeah, I just agree with his policies. I don't too much care for the things that he says and the actual maturity of his Christianity. There were some, I could probably count on one hand how many I can remember, but for the totality of the Republican Party, and I hate to overgeneralize like this, but that's just from what I've seen. I mean, it is what it is, like from what we've seen, from what our media shows, from what, non bipartisan, articles and stuff that I read. Not bipartisan. I think it's just bipartisan. From those, neutral articles that I like to read because I listen to both sides. I think that the conservatives failed the Christians in it made things weird. One, that's the thing. It made things weird because on one hand, you're saying, well, we're not enacting certain things like the Equality Act. We're not passing any, acts or bills on gender neutral bathrooms or genderless reassignments where people can change their genders. Like on one hand, the Christians were like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. We're protecting Israel. We're not endorsing homosexual behaviors. Like these are all things that we believe in. Like I think on one hand, that was cool, and we were grabbing hold onto that. But then on the other hand, you had certain sayings, you had certain pandering that was going on to where when there is an obvious group of people that are racist without saying they are racist, they're racist from their actions, from their speech, from just how they even look. I mean, you can obviously tell that the KKK is a racist organization, right? You can obviously tell that white nationalists and KKKs, however you call them nowadays. I don't even know what they're called now, but they're obviously racist. I think when you don't speak on that side of things is when that completely reminds me at the end of the day that politics is all propaganda. It's all pandering. It's all, biased rhetoric that is fitting for one goal and one goal at the end of the day, and that is to get your vote. Right. And so I think the conservatives failed us Christians in that and not telling us like, look, I'm a Christian. I've got these beliefs. Unfortunately, this man says a lot of things that maybe aren't Christian like, but because of his policies, I'm voting for him. I think there could have been more rhetoric on that. And I think that's where it failed us. What are your thoughts?
So I think we don't even have to debate whether or not the Democrats failed Christians. I mean, liberals and all that. They just basically said, hey, we're just trying our best not to offend until we get in office. As we discussed with the Equality Act, once they get in office, then they don't care. Once they have majority power of the House and the Senate, then they don't care about offending. But they just do their best to not offend as much as possible while still speaking to their crowd. Conservatives pander, like, I mean, the way Democrats pander to black people is how conservatives pander to Christians. And so when I think about, did the conservatives fail us as believers, as Christians? I would say yes and no. I would say yes in that they have infiltrated our churches, and they they've allowed a lot of things to be nationalized to the extent to where it's like, you know, being American and being Christian go hand in hand, and it has to be it has to look a certain type of way. It has to, you can't disagree with certain things. I would say that the Republicans have failed the church because they haven't accurately represented us. And so what ends up happening is there are Christians that would have wanted to be, who are really conservative in their lifestyle. I would consider myself conservative in my lifestyle, how I live, how I follow the Bible, and how, the things that I'm for. So I would say there's an aspect of me that's conservative in that regard. But the issue I run into is when it comes to like a lot of conservatism is like a lot of the stuff doesn't fully speak to me in nuance. It's really black and white. It's really, anti-abortion, which I'm cool with, because I'm pro-life, so I'm cool with anti-abortion, against same-sex marriage. Yeah, I believe marriage is exclusive between man and woman. I don't know that, same sex, I wouldn't consider that marriage, and that's me. But I do believe they could legally have a union, but I just don't look at it as marriage as defined in the Bible as a Christian, as a believer. And that's just where I stand. It's not from a hateful place. It's just I'm standing on the word. The word doesn't consider, the same sex, marriage. And, that's just where I'm at with that. But I think, again, conservatives and politicians in general lead way more with what they are against than what they're for. And as a result, that infiltrated the church. And so we have that mentality a lot of times where it's like, this is what we're against. We're against same-sex marriage. We're against abortion. We're against all of these different things. We're against debt. We're against all these things. And some of that, there's some really good stuff in there, but it's like, what the heck are conservatives for? You start to forget. And if you're representing the church in any way, because they do speak about God, they talk about God a lot, Jesus specifically in most cases, so they're very much out. They come off as Christian in that regard, and if they're not against the church, if they're not for the church, we know that they're not against it. And so in that regard, they win. But it's like, okay, are you really speaking on behalf of Christians, even though a good chunk of their base is Christian and votes faithfully because of their Christian views. But a lot of Christians were really disappointed and let down, I think, as far as the response to Donald Trump, because there was there was a lot of people that voted for him, which is fine. He earned it by all accounts. He earned his seat. But I think there were a lot of Christians that were like, this is hypocrisy. You got to speak out on this. You got to be fair about how you evaluate. Some of this is ridiculous. Some of this is just unacceptable. And there were some that spoke to it, but there were others that were willing, to like defend it. Like for me, it's like, no, like even to this day, like you have Mitch McConnell who's saying, this was unacceptable. He was definitely the one that started the fire at the Capitol. But then a few days later, he says that you're the one that started it, but then doesn't vote for him to be impeached. He says it. He's like, it definitely was his fault, but I'm not going to vote for him to be impeached. So he says it's his fault and doesn't make that vote. And then it recently says that they ask him if Trump is the Republican nominee for 2024, would you support him? He's like, absolutely. It's like, they speak out of both sides of their mouths because they want to pander to his crowd. They want to pander to that segment, and they know that they'll lose them if they don't take a hardline stance. But that's where I think they failed the church, is because they forced us to feel like we have to go with somebody that just is not the role. And that hurts the witness of the church as a result, because it felt like we had to support Trump because he was a Republican nominee. It really hindered us because it made a lot of Christians look like bigots. It made us look like supporters of bigotry, of all that stuff. It's the associations. We're now associated with a guy that is not, by all accounts, not living a Christian life, unlikely to be a real Christian. It just really was a bad look. He was a real bad look for the church, and I'm just being brutally honest. And we had to accept, those that voted Republican had to accept him, because he wasn't going to be against the church. In fact, and I will give Christians this, he was the most policy-wise pro-Christian president we've ever had. That's a fact, policy-wise. But character-wise, he was the most anti-Christian president we've ever had, as far as his character and because even with the presidents that we've had that were terrible, like as far as their character and like morality and things like that, like Bill Clinton and all, we can go on and on. At least they didn't divide in regards to like they didn't cause the church to be so divided again, with the people. There's many Christians that firmly, and I don't agree with them on this, that firmly believe if you voted for Trump, you are a racist. And they have want nothing to do with you because you voted for a man of that character. And that's how they feel about some pastors. And it's unfair. I don't agree with that. But the fact that that much stigma would be associated to a single man, and there was never there wasn't until recently there was very little condemnation toward him from his party. Like that's where you start to see, and that's just how it works. That's the name of the game. But if you ask me the question, did they fail? Did they fail Christians? Yeah, they failed Christians because they never were in the business of pleasing Christians. They were in the business of building their base and not offending Christians. And I think they succeeded in that regard. But I think ultimately they've made our ability to witness a little bit harder.
Yeah, I even heard people talking about they're gonna create their own party, which if you know anything about me, I'm all for I'm sort of like an independent. I don't know if that's the correct term now because that may be an actual party, but I'm sort of like an independent here. I vote for everything that's closest to that's near and dear to me. And I get questioned a lot on this, and I think that's why you always hear me try to revert back to the theocracy ideology because I just find so many faults in both sides. Like how you just mentioned, like they were never in the business of trying to, what's the word you use? Like cater to Christians. Like they enacted certain things, they did certain things to gain that, but at the end of the day, it was for one thing only, and that was the vote. And so I don't think neither party is for us, to be honest. Like Trump, yeah, he did some things
Oh
that
yeah.
were most, like you mentioned, as president, was policy wise, were most for Christians. But how do you do that all while cussing folks out and calling different nations, dirty countries and things like that? Like, it's hard for me to do that. It's hard for me to rock with that. That's not Christian like for me. And because I am a realist, I just logically that doesn't make sense to be, looking to one of these parties for. And I think a lot of Christians failed. I think a lot of leaders within the Christian body failed, lay members and failed, people who don't understand these things in such a way to where, yeah, now it puts them in a hard position to say, man, well, what am I supposed to do? I got to vote this way because although they got these two policies that, I just can't be seen, it's just a whole thing. And I think one day, I pray that there is a party that stands for just Jesus and Jesus alone, where there is no, feeling like you got to vote for the lesser of two evils. I just feel like somehow, some way, there's going to be something that's lifted up where people can just vote for Jesus and Jesus alone. I don't know how that'll work, but I firmly believe, man, maybe one day this could actually happen. So. I think conservatives failed us. I think Democrats failed us, and we're seeing it. But that's the world we live in, and it's up to us Christians to, at the end of the day, commit to the things that that God has shown us, that the scripture has reminded us. At the end of the day, it's still up to us to show love. We're not to compromise, but we're to show compassion. And so the way we are to reach these people, it's going to be something in where it takes a lot of prayer. And when I say these people, I mean sinners. I mean, whether you're, in this sin or that sin, whether you eat too much and commit gluttony, the way we are to reach sinners, the way we are to reach people is through love. And that message has never changed. So regardless of what sin you're in, we're going to reach you in such a way to where we're not offensive, where we're not pandering, we're not compromising, but it's going to be through a message of love, and that's going to be backed up through support and prayer. Everything we share with you is backed up with, well, Christians, that is. I don't know about these fake Christians, but Christians, that is. It's going to be backed up through support and prayer. And so, and ultimately what that means is Jesus is backing all of this if it's in love, if it's in love. So